He looked her dead in the eyes in front of everyone in that room and said 4 words she never forgot. "I don't date black women." She didn't flinch, she didn't cry, not yet. She just smiled, set the phone down on his desk, screen facing up, and let the DNA result do the talking. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who believes that truth always finds its way back, no matter how deep someone buries it, this story was written for you. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. Because this one is going to stay with you long after it ends. Let's get into it. There is a version of Han Dojin that almost nobody alive has seen. He laughed easily in that version. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. He once sat on the floor of a tiny apartment kitchen in Accra at 2 in the morning, eating jollof rice out of a pot because they'd forgotten to buy plates. And he looked, in that moment, like a man who had finally exhaled. That version of him disappeared 5 years ago. The version that replaced him wears a black suit like armor, keeps a gold watch on his left wrist that he checks whenever a conversation makes him uncomfortable, runs a business empire that nobody asks too many questions about, and has a rule, unspoken, but absolute, about who belongs in his world and who does not. Kalani Aziza knew both versions. She was the only person alive who did. And on a Tuesday morning in Seoul, with rain tapping against floor-to-ceiling windows and the city spread out below like a map of everything she'd survived, she walked into his building with a phone in her hand, a result on the screen, and 5 years of silence finally ready to break. This is how it happened. She had rehearsed this moment 400 times. None of those rehearsals prepared her for the way he looked through her, not at her, through her, like she was glass. The lobby of Han Dojin's building smelled like cold marble and money. Kalani noticed that first. Then the silence, the specific, curated kind that only exists in spaces designed to make people feel small before they even reach the elevator. 2 security desks, 4 cameras she could spot, and probably 2 she couldn't. A receptionist with a smile so practiced it had become its own kind of wall. Kalani walked to that desk like she had an appointment. She did not have an appointment. "Kalani Aziza," she said, her voice came out steady. "Good. I'm here to see Han Dojin." The receptionist's smile didn't move. "Do you have a scheduled meeting, MS?" "Aziza, and no, but tell him that name." She paused. "He'll know it." She was not entirely sure that was true anymore. She stood to the side and waited, watched the receptionist murmur into a headset. I watched the slight flicker, just a flicker of something cross the young woman's face when the response came back. Then the receptionist looked up with the same practiced smile, slightly tighter now. "Mr. Han will see you. 42nd floor. Someone will escort you." Kalani exhaled through her nose. He remembered. The elevator ride was 42 floors of her heartbeat being too loud in a too quiet box. She looked at her reflection in the mirrored doors. Natural locks, cream blouse, the phone in her hand, screen dark for now. She looked like someone who had it together. She had been practicing looking like someone who had it together for 5 years. The doors opened. And there he was across a vast, glass-walled office, standing with his back to her, looking out at Seoul like he owned it. He probably did. He didn't turn around immediately, made her walk the full length of the room before he did, when he finally turned. He looked exactly the same. That was the thing nobody warned you about, that people who broke you could just look exactly the same. His eyes moved over her face. Something shifted in them, fast, like a light switching on and then immediately being covered. Then his expression settled back into careful, practiced nothing. "Kalani Aziza," he said, like he was reading her name off a document. She held up the phone, screen on. DNA match, 99.9%. The room went very, very quiet. Han Dojin's jaw tightened by exactly 1 millimeter, and Kalani knew, in that moment, that he had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The coldest things Han Dojin ever said, he said quietly. And what he said next, she would carry for the rest of her life until the truth forced him to carry it too. He looked at the phone for a long time. Then he looked at her. Then, and this was the part she would replay later alone, in a hotel room 12 blocks away, he stepped back. Not physically. Something behind his eyes stepped back. Retreated behind that wall he'd built so high and so smooth there were no handholds left. I don't know what this is supposed to prove, he said. Read it, Kalani said quietly. I have read it. Read it again. His jaw moved. He looked down at the screen one more time and then set the phone, gently, almost carefully, back on the edge of the desk between them. DNA results can be manipulated, he said. I have people who do it professionally. She had expected that. She had a response ready. But before she could speak, the door behind her opened and two men in dark suits stepped inside, assistants, advisors she didn't know. What she knew was the way Dojin's posture shifted when they entered. Straighter, more sealed. He was performing now. For them or for himself, she couldn't tell. Who arranged this meeting? One of the men asked, not to her, to Dojin about her, like she wasn't standing right there. Dojin looked at her, and then he said it. Calm, quiet, and almost bored. I don't date black women. 4 words, said like a policy, like a company rule read aloud from a handbook. She felt it land the way a flat stone lands on still water, not loud, but spreading, moving outward through her chest in slow, horrible rings. She did not flinch. She had promised herself she would not flinch. That's fine, she said, her voice so level it surprised her. This isn't about dating. She picked the phone back up. This is about the truth. And the truth, she looked at him, really looked at him, past the suit and the wall and the performance, doesn't care about your policies, Dojin. She left the phone's photo on his screen as she walked out. It was a photograph, old, slightly creased at the edges like it had been folded and unfolded many times. 2 people, a small kitchen, a pot of jollof rice on the floor between them. Both of them were laughing. The door closed behind her, and Han Dojin stood in his glass office, in his perfect suit, staring at a face he had spent 5 years training himself to forget. And felt, for the first time in a long time, like the walls were not keeping anything out. They were keeping something in. Han Dojin didn't sleep that night. Not because of the DNA result, not even because of the photograph, but because somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning, he found a gap in his own memory. And gaps in his world meant only one thing. Someone had put them there. He kept the photograph. He told himself he kept it as evidence, something to hand to his security team, to have authenticated, to dismiss properly. He did not look at it again before bed. He set it face down on his desk and went home. He did not sleep. At 1:17 a.m., he was back in his private office, in a shirt and no jacket for once, with a glass of water he hadn't touched, and his laptop open to a database only 3 people in his organization had access to. He told himself he was running due diligence on Kalani Aziza. He was lying to himself. What he was actually doing was looking for the gap. Because there was a gap, he had felt at the moment he saw the photograph, a specific, textured blankness, like pressing your tongue to a place where a tooth used to be. He knew the kitchen in that photograph. He knew the feeling of that kitchen. But the memory itself was like looking at something through frosted glass. He could see the shape of it, but not the detail. Why couldn't he remember her face? He typed her name, Kalani Aziza. The results that came back were thin, sparse in a way that felt deliberate. A professional profile, a university record from Accra, a research consultancy she'd run for 3 years. Nothing that explained how her DNA shared 99.9% of a match with. He stopped. He went back to an older folder, one he hadn't opened in years. Personal records from the period before the organization formalized, before the suits and the building and the title. He searched for Accra. 3 files, all administrative, all remarkably clean. Too clean. He knew what his records from that period looked like. They were messy, half-finished entries, overlapping dates, the kind of documentation a young man made when he was figuring out the world in real time. These 3 files were neat, edited. His hand paused over the keyboard. He thought about who had access to those records. Only one name came up. Mun Seojin. He closed the laptop, sat in the dark for a moment, then I opened it again. Seojin, he typed into their private message channel. I need to see you tomorrow, early. The reply came back in under a minute, even at this hour. Of course, is everything all right? Dojin stared at those 4 words on the screen. Is everything all right? Yes, he typed back. Everything's fine. He was again lying. Because nothing would ever be quite fine again. Not after tonight, not after the gap, not after the photograph of a kitchen he remembered feeling but couldn't remember seeing. Somewhere across the city, in a hotel room 12 blocks away, Kalani Aziza sat on the edge of a bed with a second folder in her lap, one she hadn't shown him yet. She was deciding whether to give him the chance to find the truth himself, or whether she'd already waited long enough. There is a specific kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with cruelty or malice. It arrives wearing a calm face and good intentions, and that is precisely what makes it the most dangerous kind of all. Mun Seojin arrived at 7:15 in the morning carrying 2 coffees and a leather folio, like it was any other early briefing. He was older than Dojin by 11 years, silver at his temples, steady hands. He had been there at the beginning, before the empire, before the building, before the title. He was the one who had helped Dojin build the architecture of who he was supposed to be. Dojin had trusted him, the way you trust the ground beneath your feet. He set the photograph on the table between them, face up, before Seojin had even sat down. Seojin looked at it. A pause, brief, controlled. His face did not change very much, but his hand, reaching for the coffee cup, stopped for just a half-second before continuing. Dojin saw it. Tell me about Accra, Dojin said. That was a long time ago, Seojin said. Tell me anyway. Another pause. Seojin sat down, wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, a gesture Dojin had always read as comfort-seeking and now read differently. You were in a difficult period, Seojin said carefully. You were making emotional decisions, getting close to someone who didn't fit the trajectory we had planned for the organization. Dojin noticed that word. I asked you about Accra, Dojin said, not about the organization. Seojin looked at him for a moment. Then he sighed, the patient sigh of a man who had been waiting for this conversation for years and had prepared for it thoroughly. She was good for the man you were then, Seojin said. She was not good for the man you needed to become. I made a decision. I stand by it. The room was very quiet. What kind of decision? Dojin said. I had a conversation with her. I explained the situation. I may have. He paused, choosing words. It presented your position more firmly than you had expressed it at the time. More firmly. Dojin looked at the man who had shaped the last decade of his life. The man who had sat beside him in every significant room. The man he had called, without irony, his closest advisor. You told her I didn't want her, Dojin said. Seojin said nothing. You told her I didn't want her, Dojin said again, and then you went into my records and removed the evidence that she had ever existed. I protected you. You decided for me. The words came out low, measured. Somehow that was worse than shouting. You looked at her and you decided she didn't belong, and then you made sure I couldn't remember why I thought she did. Seojin set his coffee down. The records I adjusted were. I want you to leave, Dojin said. Dojin, I want you to leave this office. I want your access codes suspended by noon, and I want every file, every single file, from that period restored to its original condition by tonight. Seojin stood slowly. He looked for a moment like he might argue, then something in Dojin's expression stopped him. He picked up his folio, left both coffees on the table. At the door he paused. She came back, he said quietly. After all this time, she came back, That should tell you something about what you threw away." He left. Dojin sat alone in the silence of his office, with a photograph between his hands and 5 years of constructed certainty quietly, coming apart at the seams. He had one question now, just one. Would she still be in Seoul by the time he figured out what to say? Kalani had a flight booked for Thursday. It was Wednesday morning. She had exactly 36 hours to decide whether the truth she had carried across 5 years and 2 continents was something she was willing to leave behind. Again. The hotel room was nice. She hadn't booked it herself. The consultancy she was working for had arranged it. Not knowing what else she'd be doing in Seoul this week. Big window, city view, the kind of room that felt lonely in a specifically luxurious way. She was on her 3rd cup of tea, sitting cross-legged on the bed with the 2nd folder open in her lap, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, Seoul area code. She stared at it for 2 rings. Picked up. "You found the photograph," she said, not a question. A pause on the other end, long enough that she could hear the city behind him, the particular hum of high floors and sealed windows. "How long have you known?" His voice was different from yesterday. The performance was gone. What was left underneath was quieter, rougher around the edges, more like the voice she remembered from the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning. She hated how much she recognized it. "About Seoul," she exhaled slowly. 3 years, I found a record he missed. A small one, a hotel booking in Accra, cross-referenced with your organization's travel logs." She paused. "It put him in the city the same week you left." Another silence. "I want to," he started. "Don't," she said, and then softer, "not over the phone." She heard him breathe. "Are you leaving Thursday?" he asked. She looked at the folder in her lap, at the documents inside, the full paper trail she had built over 3 years of quiet, methodical, furious research. The thing she had carried was like a second spine. She had 2 options. Leave Thursday. File the documents with the appropriate parties. Let the truth do its work without her in the room. Walk away clean, or as clean as you could walk away from something that had never really let you go. Or, "There's a cafe," she said. "Across from the Gyeongbokgung gate. I'll be there at 9 tomorrow morning." She heard him exhale. "Kalani." "Don't be late," she said, "and don't bring anyone." She hung up, set the phone face down on the duvet. Outside, Seoul hummed and glittered in the gray morning light, indifferent and enormous and alive. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up the 2nd folder. Hold it. There was something in it that Dojin didn't know yet. Something that went further back than Seoul, further back than Accra, further back than both of them. Something that would change, not just the story of what they had been to each other, but the story of what they both came from. She hadn't decided yet whether to show him. But she was still in Seoul. And that, for tonight, was enough. There is a difference between someone who shows up and someone who shows up ready. Han Dojin had spent the entire night preparing what he would say. He walked into that cafe and forgot every word of it. He arrived at 8:53. He told himself that was a coincidence. It was not a coincidence. He had left 40 minutes early, driven past the cafe twice, and finally parked 3 streets away and walked, because sitting in a car felt too much like hiding, and he was done. He had decided with hiding. The cafe was small, warm-lit, the kind of place that smelled like roasted beans and old wood and had mismatched chairs that somehow worked together, not the kind of place he usually sat in. Exactly the kind of place, he realized as he ducked through the low doorway, that he used to love. She was already there. Of course she was. Corner table. Facing the door, she had always faced the door. He remembered that now with a small, startling clarity, like a light flickering on in a hallway he'd forgotten existed. A cup of something between her hands. The 2nd folder on the table beside her, closed. She watched him navigate the room, didn't smile, didn't look away either. He sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe moved around them, a barista calling out an order, the scrape of a chair, rain beginning again against the window. All of it felt very far away. "You look terrible," she said finally. "I didn't sleep," he said. "I know. You never could sleep when something was unresolved." The fact that she knew that, the fact that she had kept that small specific truth about him stored somewhere safe, while he had lost almost everything about her, sat between them like a stone. "Kalani." "Let me go first," she said, not unkindly, just firmly. He closed his mouth, nodded. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I'm not here for an apology," she said. "I need you to understand that before we go any further. I didn't cross 2 continents and 5 years of my life for sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back what I lost. It doesn't give you back what you lost either." She paused. "I came because of what's in this folder, because the truth here belongs to both of us, and I couldn't keep carrying it alone." He looked at the folder. "What's in it?" he asked. She didn't open it yet. "Tell me first," she said quietly. "Tell me what you remember, about Accra, about us. Tell me what's actually there when you stop letting Seojan's version take up the space." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, haltingly, like a man reading a map he'd only just realized was upside down, he began to remember. And with every word he spoke, Kalani's hands tightened slightly around her cup. Because he remembered more than she'd expected. And that, somehow, was the hardest thing of all. Memory is not a recording. It is a house, and someone had been inside his, moving the furniture. He just hadn't noticed because he'd stopped walking through the rooms. He remembered the heat first. Accra in March, a dry, golden kind of heat that sat on your shoulders like a hand. He had been there on an early scouting trip for the organization, before it was the organization, when it was still just a plan and a few trusted people and a lot of careful conversations in small rooms. He had been 29, tired in a way he didn't have language for yet. He remembered a bookshop, the specific smell of it, paper and dust, and something floral he couldn't place. He remembered reaching for a book on a high shelf and someone else's hand reaching for the same one at the same time. He looked up at Kalani, across the cafe table. "The bookshop," he said. Something moved through her expression, fast and quiet. "Mensa and Sons," she said. "On the high street, your twee was terrible." Despite everything, the corner of his mouth moved. "I was trying." "You asked the owner if he had any books about chicken. You meant history." He put his hand over his face briefly. The gesture was so unguarded, so unlike the man in the black suit, that Kalani felt something pull tight in her chest. "There he is," she thought. "There's the one I knew." He lowered his hand. "We talked for 3 hours, he said slowly. "In the bookshop and then on the street outside and then in the restaurant next door. And I remember thinking," he stopped. "What?" she said. "I remember thinking I had never talked to anyone like that before." He said it like it cost him something. Like the conversation was a place you could actually live in. The cafe was soft around them, rain steady on the glass. "You stayed 4 extra days," Kalani said quietly. "I told Seojan it was for scouting." "Was it?" A pause. "No," he said. She nodded slowly. "I looked down at the table." "And then," she said, "after those 4 days." His expression shifted. The edges of it got harder, not with coldness this time, but with the specific frustration of someone straining to see something through fog. "It gets unclear," he said. "I remember leaving. I remember telling you I'd come back." He frowned. "I remember the meaning it." "You did mean it," she said. "I know you did." "And then?" She looked at him steadily. "And then Seojan called me," she said. 2 days after you left, he told me you'd reconsidered, that you appreciated the time but had decided it wasn't something you wanted to pursue." She paused. He said it in a very kind voice. That almost made it worse. Dojin said nothing. "He said you wanted me to know that you didn't, that it wasn't personal, that you simply didn't see a future there." Her voice stayed even, steady, the way you speak when you've had years to practice not falling apart around a particular set of words. "He said, He doesn't date black women. He hopes you understand. The table between them was very still. Kalani. He used your voice, Dojin. She looked at him directly. He called from a number I recognized. He knew things about our conversations that only you could have told him. I had no reason not to believe him. Han Dojin sat with that. Sat with the image of a 29-year-old version of himself, open, tired. Laughing on a bookshop floor, being quietly, efficiently, erased from someone's life by a man with a plan and a phone and a calm, reasonable voice. His hands, flat on the table, pressed down slowly. I'm going to need a moment, he said. Take it, she said. She picked up her cup, waited. Outside, the rain came down harder. And somewhere in the architecture of Han Dojin's carefully constructed self-A wall that had been standing for 5 years developed its first real crack. She had not planned to show him everything today. She had planned to measure it out, give him only what he could handle, protect herself by controlling the pace. But then he said the one thing she hadn't prepared for, and the plan dissolved. He said, I looked for you. She went very still. After 6 months, he said, I started to feel like something was wrong, like I'd left something behind and couldn't name it. I asked Seojin if he had contact details from the Accra trip. He said the files were incomplete. He paused. I should have pushed harder. Yes, she said simply. You should have. I know. They sat with that for a moment, the both of them holding the weight of a choice not made, a push not given, a 6-month window that had quietly and permanently closed. Then Kalani pulled the second folder toward her. She opened it. She turned it so it faced him and slid it across the table. He looked down. The first page was a family record. Old, the paper quality was different from the photocopies beneath it. Handwritten in 2 languages, Korean on one side, Twi on the other. He leaned forward. His name was not on it, but his grandfather was. He looked up at her. Keep reading, she said. He turned the page. A photograph, black and white, late 1960s by the clothing. A Korean man in a light shirt, standing in front of a building that looked vaguely familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. Beside him, a Ghanaian woman in a printed dress, laughing at something off camera. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting he didn't recognize. Kwame and Sujin, Accra, 1968. His grandfather's name was Kwame. He had always been told it was a nickname, a local name he'd picked up during a brief business posting, something that didn't mean anything. He stared at the photograph for a long time. Her name was Abina Boateng, Kalani said quietly. She was my great-aunt. She and your grandfather met in Accra in 1967 during his trade posting. They were together for almost 2 years. She paused. Your family ended it, arranged his marriage back home. He left. Kalani's voice softened slightly. She didn't recover from it easily. How do you know all this? He asked. She wrote everything down, Kalani said. Letters, diaries, records. She kept all of it. When she passed, it came to my mother. When my mother passed, it came to me. She looked at him steadily. I didn't know what I had for a long time, not until I started cross-referencing the names and realized who your grandfather actually was. He turned another page. More documents, dates, entries, a name appearing again and again in his gray-tant's handwriting. Kwame says he'll find a way. Kwame says it doesn't matter what they think. Kwame says. He closed the folder gently. He needed to close the folder. So, he said, his voice careful, our families have been here before, Kalani said. Yes. He looked at her. And you think, what happened to them? I think history has a habit of repeating itself, she said, until someone decides to read it properly. She held his gaze. Seojin didn't just manipulate 2 people who met in a bookshop. He was protecting a pattern, Dojin. A pattern that goes back further than either of us. The idea that certain connections are inconvenient, that they should be managed away before they become something that can't be controlled. The rain had stopped outside. The cafe felt quieter now, more still. You came here to show me this, he said. "I came here because you deserve to know where you come from," she said. "And because I was tired," she exhaled slowly, "of being the only one carrying it." He looked down at the closed folder, then back at her. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there in his office 2 days ago. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated than guilt. Something that looked, cautiously, like the beginning of understanding. She almost left. That part doesn't get told often enough. The moment she stood at the departure board with her bag and her ticket and her whole carefully rebuilt life waiting on the other side of that gate, and almost chose it. Thursday came. Kalani was at Incheon Airport by 7 a.m. bag checked. Boarding pass on her phone. A coffee going cold in her hand because she'd bought it out of routine and then forgotten to drink it. Her flight was at 10:15. She sat in the departure hall and looked at the board and thought about her apartment in London. The clean lines of it. The shelf of books she'd alphabetized when she was going through a control phase and never rearranged. The neighbor's cat that sat on her windowsill on Tuesday mornings. The life she had built specifically to have no gaps in it, no spaces shaped like someone else. She thought about the folder she had finally given away. She thought about the look on Dojin's face when he read his grandfather's name. She thought about his voice in the cafe saying, "I looked for you," the way it landed. How she hadn't let herself react to it in the moment because she had learned, painfully and thoroughly, not to let his words move her before she'd verified what they meant. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message, no greeting, just, "I went to the records office this morning. I found the original registration. Kwame Han Seojung. Your great-aunt is listed as his emergency contact. For almost 2 years, she was listed as the person to call if anything happened to him." She stared at the screen. Another message. She was his person, and someone decided that wasn't the right story, so they told a different one. Then, "I don't want to tell a different story." She set the phone face down on her knee. I looked at the departure board. Gate 47, boarding in 2 hours and 40 minutes. She picked up her cold coffee, took a sip, made a face at the temperature and kept drinking it anyway. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't look at it immediately this time. Made herself wait. Made herself sit with the question she'd been sitting with since Wednesday morning in a cafe by the Gyeongbokgung gate. Was she walking toward something or away from it? There was a version of this where she got on the plane, filed the family records with a heritage organization, sent Dojin a scanned copy and let him deal with the rest on his own, went home, fed the neighbor's cat, went back to her work and her shelf of alphabetized books and her deliberate, constructed, gap-free life. That version was safe. That version cost nothing she hadn't already paid. She looked at the phone. His last message said, "I know I don't have the right to ask you to stay. I know I haven't earned that, but I'm asking anyway. Not for the story, not for what our families were to each other." A pause in the timestamps. Then, "For what I think we could figure out how to be, if you were willing to let me be slow about it." Let me be slow about it. She put the phone in her bag, picked up her carry-on. I stood up, walked toward the exit. Not gate 47. The exit. She didn't let herself think too hard about it. Sometimes the only way to make the brave choice is to make it before the sensible part of you catches up. She pushed through the doors. Seoul received her. Gray and enormous and indifferent, and for reasons she was not yet ready to fully examine, feeling, for the first time in 5 years. A little bit like somewhere she could breathe. He had expected her to have conditions. A list, logical, justified, every item on it earned by his absence. What he had not expected was that her only condition would be the one that was hardest for a man like him to keep. She texted him from the taxi. "I stayed, don't make me regret it." He read it standing in the middle of his office, jacket off, the second folder open on his desk alongside a spread of documents his records team had spent the last 18 hours restoring. 5 years of carefully edited history coming back in pieces. Names, dates, places. "Sir." He typed back, "Where are you staying?" She sent the hotel name. He almost typed, "I'll come now," stopped himself, read her message again. "Don't make me regret it." He typed instead, "Are you free tomorrow evening?" A pause, then, "Depends on what you're suggesting." "Dinner, somewhere with mismatched chairs." Another pause, longer this time. 7 o'clock, you pick the place. He set the phone down and stood very still for a moment in his quiet office with the city spread out behind him. He was not a man who did things slowly. His entire life had been built on decisive, rapid, controlled movement: assess, decide, act. Sentiment was a thing that slowed you down, and slowness, in his world, had consequences. And yet, he thought about a cafe with rain on the windows, and a woman with steady hands, and a folder full of truth he hadn't been brave enough to find on his own. He thought about his grandfather's name on an emergency contact form, the person to call if anything happened. His person. He thought about what it meant, really meant, that someone had looked at a connection like that and decided it was a problem to be managed. He picked up the phone again, scrolled to a different contact. His lawyer. "I need to begin formal proceedings," he said when she answered, "relating to unauthorized alteration of organizational records." He paused. "The individual in question is Mun Siajan." He listened. "Yes," he said, "I'm certain." He hung up. He looked at the photograph of his grandfather, printed now, from the scan Kalani had sent him, sitting in a frame he'd found in a drawer. Quaim and Sujan. Accra, 1968. Both of them were laughing. Some things he was starting to understand were not coincidences. Some things were patterns trying to complete themselves. Dinner was quiet. The restaurant he found had mismatched chairs and candles in old wine bottles and a menu handwritten on a chalkboard. She laughed when she walked in, a real laugh, surprised out of her, quickly recovered. He filed that laugh away carefully, the way you file away something you don't want to lose again. They talked for 3 hours. Not about Siajan, not about the documents or the proceedings or the family records. They talked about her consultancy work, about a book she'd been trying to finish reading for 6 months, about a neighborhood in Accra that had changed almost beyond recognition, about small things, real things. At the end of the evening, standing outside on a cool Seoul street, she looked at him and said, "Slow, Dojin, I mean it, we go slow." "I know," he said. "I don't want grand gestures. I don't want you to perform your way into my trust." "I know. I just want," she paused, searching for it, "consistent. I want you to just be consistent." He looked at her in the quiet street, the city lit up behind her, her locks, her steady eyes, the way she stood like someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed and not 1 inch less. "Consistent," he said. "I can do it consistently." She nodded once. Like a small agreement. Like the first line of a new kind of contract. He walked her back to her hotel. They said goodnight at the door, nothing dramatic, nothing performed. Just 2 people standing in the ordinary light of a hotel lobby, choosing, quietly and deliberately. To begin, nobody tells you what consistency actually looks like. It doesn't look like roses or grand speeches. It looks like a text at 7 a.m. asking if you've eaten. It looks like showing up, even when showing up is inconvenient. It looks, if you're paying attention, exactly like someone deciding, over and over again, that you are worth the effort. He texted her every morning. Not long messages, nothing that required a response. Sometimes just a photograph, a corner of Seoul she might not have seen, a funny sign outside a restaurant, once a very serious-looking cat sitting on the hood of an expensive car outside his building. Just presence. A small, daily reminder that he was thinking of her without demanding that she think about him in return. She noticed. She didn't tell him she noticed, but she started waking up a few minutes earlier than she needed to, just in case. She was in Seoul for 2 more weeks. Her consultancy project had an extended timeline, and she had, quietly and without making a significant thing of it, requested to manage her portion on-site rather than remotely. Her colleagues asked no questions. They were used to her making clean, efficient decisions. Only Kalani knew this one had nothing efficient about it. They fell into a rhythm the way people do when they are both being careful, gradually, without announcing it. Dinner twice a week. A walk on Sunday morning through Bukshan Hanok village, where the old wooden houses sat patient and golden in the early light. Phone calls that started as practical, "Are we still on for Thursday?" and became, almost accidentally, 2-hour conversations about everything and nothing. She was careful. She had earned the right to be careful. But she noticed the ways he was different from the man in the glass office. He asked questions, real questions, not polite conversation starters, but the kind that told you he had actually been listening the last time you spoke. He remembered that she took her tea without sugar, that she had a complicated relationship with her father's side of the family, that she'd wanted to be an architect as a child and had pivoted to research consultancy because, as she'd said once, laughing, "Buildings don't argue with you, but clients do, and at least with clients you can leave." He laughed at that, genuinely, the same laugh from a kitchen floor in Accra, finally finding its way back to the surface. She filed that away too. There were hard moments, moments where old hurt surfaced without warning, a phrase he used, a particular silence, a reflex of his that reminded her of the version she hadn't chosen. She didn't hide those moments. She told him carefully what they felt like. He listened without defending himself. That was new. That was the thing that started, slowly, cautiously, to rebuild something she had thought was permanently gone. One evening, walking back from dinner, he stopped outside a bookshop. Small, warm-lit, books stacked in the window. He looked at her. "Shall we?" he said. She looked at the bookshop. I looked at him. And something in her chest that had been held tight and careful for 5 years loosened, just slightly, just enough. "Yes," she said. They went in. Han Dojin had sat in many difficult rooms. He had never sat in one where the man across the table was someone he had once called family. The legal proceedings against Mun Seojan were not about revenge. He needed Kalani to know that. He needed himself to know that. This was about the record, about making sure that what was erased was restored. The formal hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning. Kalani did not attend. He hadn't asked her to. This was not her burden to carry. She had carried enough. He had his legal team. He had the restored records. He had, most critically, a digital trail that Seojan had believed was buried beyond recovery. It had not been beyond recovery. It had taken 18 days and 4 specialists, but it was there. Dojin sat at one side of a long table in a lawyer's office that smelled like old paper and central heating. Seojan sat at the other side, older looking than he had in the office that morning 2 weeks ago. Smaller, somehow. Without the leather folio and the 2 coffees and the practiced calm, he was just a man who had made decisions he was now being asked to account for. His lawyer spoke first. Mitigation, context. The decisions were made in the best interest of the organization. Language designed to reduce a person's choices to a series of professional calculations, stripped of their human cost. Dojin let him finish. Then he spoke. He did not speak about the organization. He did not speak about the manipulated files, or the adjusted records, or the travel logs that put Seojan in Accra the week he disappeared from Kalani's life. He spoke about a bookshop. He spoke about a woman who had carried a folder of truth across 2 continents in 5 years because no one else was going to. He spoke about his grandfather's name on an emergency contact form, the simplest, most human declaration of importance that exists, and what it meant that someone had decided that declaration was inconvenient. He spoke quietly, without performance. When he finished, the room was still. Seojan looked at him from across the table. His expression was difficult to read. Not guilty, exactly. Not remorseless either. Something more complicated, the face of a man who believed he had been right and was only now beginning to feel the weight of what right had cost. "I did what I thought was best for you," Seojan said. "I know," Dojin said. That's the part I'm still working through. Because that was true. The anger was clean and simple, the anger at the manipulation, the erasure, the theft of something real. But underneath it was something harder to process, the grief of losing a mentor, of having to dismantle a relationship that had been load-bearing in his life for over a decade. He was not pretending, that was simple. He was not going to pretend anything anymore. The terms were settled. Seojin's access to the organization was formally ended. The records were restored and properly archived. A statement, carefully worded, legally sound, was placed on file. It wasn't everything. It wasn't 5 years ago. It wasn't the kitchen floor or the bookshop or the 4 extra days in Accra. But the record was corrected. And sometimes, that was where healing had to begin. Outside the lawyer's office, he stood on the pavement for a moment in the cold morning air. He took out his phone. Typed, "It's done." Her response came in less than a minute. A single word, "Good." And then, a moment later, "Are you okay?" He stood on the pavement in the gray morning and looked at those 3 words for a long time. Nobody had asked him that in longer than he could remember. He typed back, "Getting there," and meant it. Kalani Aziza had a gift for carrying things silently. It was not a gift she had been born with. It was one she had built, carefully, out of necessity. But there is a limit to how long even the steadiest person can carry something alone. And on a quiet Wednesday evening in Seoul, she finally put it down. They were in his apartment. Not for any dramatic reason. Her hotel had a maintenance issue on her floor, and he had offered, practically and without pressure, that she was welcome to use the guest room for the evening. She had accepted, practically and without reading anything into it. The guest room was comfortable, quiet, had a window that looked out over a slice of the Han River, silver dark in the evening. She hadn't gone to the guest room yet. They were in the main sitting room with tea going cold on the table between them, a habit, she was noticing, that they had both developed independently, and she was telling him something she had never told anyone. Not about him, about herself. About the 2 years after Accra. "I didn't tell anyone what happened," she said. "Not the full version. I told people it didn't work out, which was true, technically. I told myself I was fine, which was less true." She paused. I looked at her cup. "I threw myself into work. I moved cities twice. I got very good at being busy." He was listening, just listening, both hands around his cup, not moving. "The worst part wasn't the loss," she said. "I've lost things before. The worst part was the doubt." She looked up. "Whether I had been naive, whether I had imagined the whole thing, the realness of it, because if someone could just call me on a phone and undo it so cleanly, so efficiently, maybe it was never as real as I thought." "It was real," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I didn't know it then." "Kalani, I'm not saying this so you'll feel guilty," she said quickly. "I'm past that. I'm saying it because you asked me once in the cafe, do you remember? You asked me what I was hopping for when I walked into your building, and I said it wasn't about dating, which was true." She paused. "But it also wasn't the whole truth." He was very still. "What was the whole truth?" he said. She looked at him. "I wanted to know that it had been real," she said simply. "That was the whole truth. I had spent 5 years carrying a story that kept telling me I had imagined something. I needed to look you in the face and know, one way or the other, whether what we had was something, or whether I had just been a detail someone managed away." Silence. "You were not a detail," he said. The words came out rough, like they had been waiting somewhere uncomfortable to be said. "You were the only thing in that entire period of my life that felt." He stopped, steadied himself. "You were not a detail." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Small, quiet. Like releasing something she had been holding with both hands for a very long time. "Okay," she said. Just that, okay. But the way she said it, the exhale underneath it, the slight drop of her shoulders, the way she finally picked up her tea and took a sip like someone who had just set down a very heavy bag, said everything the word itself didn't. He reached across the table. Not dramatically, not with urgency. Just set his hand, open, on the table between them. She looked at it. Then, slowly, she put hers in it. And they sat like that in the quiet of his apartment, with the Han River Silverdark in the window and the tea going cold between them. And nothing for once left unsaid. There is a moment in every real love story, not the dramatic ones, not the performed ones, where the whole thing becomes undeniable. Not because something big happens, but because something small happens and you realize it always meant everything. It was Kalani's idea to go to Accra. She had been back many times for work, for family, for the quiet annual ritual of visiting her great-aunt's grave on the anniversary of her passing. It was always a private trip, something she kept to herself. This time she asked him to come. He said yes before she finished the question. They arrived on a Thursday evening. The heat met them at the airport, that dry, golden, shoulder-heavy heat, and she watched his face as it hit him. I watched him slow down slightly. Breathe. You remember it, she said. The heat, he said. Yes. They stayed in a small guest house near the high street. Nothing like his Seoul apartment, no floor-to-ceiling windows, no curated silence. Ceiling fans. A courtyard with a frangipani tree. Breakfast that came with too much bread and exactly the right amount of everything else. He loved it immediately. She watched him love it and felt something settle in her that she hadn't known was still unsettled. On the second morning, they went to Mensa and Sons. The bookshop was still there. Older, slightly reorganized, with a new section near the window that hadn't existed before. The same smell, though, paper and dust, and something floral she had always assumed was from the garden next door. They stood in the doorway for a moment. High shelf, she said. He looked, found it, reached up. She reached up at the same time. Their hands landed on the same book. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. He was smiling, not the controlled, careful expression she had first walked back into, not the performance he wore for rooms full of people who needed to believe he was untouchable. Just a smile, unguarded, slightly helpless. Same book, he said. It's a good book, she said. They bought it, shared the carrying of it between them for the rest of the day. In the afternoon, they visited her great-aunt's grave. A quiet cemetery on the edge of the city, well kept, with bougainvillea growing along the outer wall. She placed flowers, the orange ones, the ones her great-aunt had kept in a jar on her kitchen table always. Dojin stood beside her respectfully, silent. She told him about Abina, not the document version, the real version. The woman who had laughed loudly and cooked badly and kept every letter she ever received in a box under her bed. Who had loved a man across an impossible distance and written it all down because she refused to let it disappear. She would have had opinions about you, Kalani said. Good ones or bad ones, he asked. Depends on the day, she said. She had very high standards. Did she ever? He paused carefully. Did she forgive him, your great-aunt? Did she forgive my grandfather? Kalani was quiet for a moment. She wrote about it once, she said. Near the end of her life, she said she had stopped being angry a long time before that. She said, she paused, remembering the exact words, handwritten in a diary she had read so many times the spine had cracked. She said the anger was just grief wearing a harder coat. When the grief finally softened, the anger had nothing left to stand on. He was quiet beside her. I think about that a lot, Kalani said. The grief wearing a harder coat, he said. Yes. He looked at the grave, at the orange flowers. She deserved better, he said quietly. She deserved someone who stayed. Yes, Kalani said, she did. They stood together in the warm afternoon for a long time. The bougainvillea moved slightly in a small wind. He reached over slowly, no urgency, nothing performed, and took her hand. She let him. Two people standing at the grave of a love story that was never allowed to finish. Deciding, quietly and deliberately, to finish a different one. This is not a story about a man who changed his mind. This is a story about a man who discovered his mind had never been entirely his own, and a woman who waited, not out of weakness, but out of the radical belief that truth always eventually surfaces. It always does. This is what it looks like when it finally does. They came back from Accra on a Sunday. Seoul received them in autumn, the trees along the boulevards turning amber and copper, and a particular shade of red that made the city look like it was quietly catching fire. 3 months had passed since a Tuesday morning in a glass office, and a phone held up with steady hands. 3 months since I didn't date black women, said to a room full of people, as though it were a policy rather than a wound. A lot had changed in 3 months. The legal proceedings against Seoul were formally concluded. The organizational records had been restored and independently verified. A heritage organization in both Seoul and Accra had been given copies of the family documentation. Kwame and Abina's story, properly recorded for the first time, placed somewhere it couldn't be managed away again. Kalani's consultancy project had concluded. She had, technically, no professional reason to remain in Seoul. She remained in Seoul. She had found a small apartment in Mapogu, not far from the river, not far from a bookshop she had started visiting on Saturday mornings, not far from a man who sent her photographs of serious-looking cats, and remembered how she took her tea and had recently, quietly, without making it a declaration, started learning Twi from an audio course he'd downloaded at 2 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. She had found that out by accident, heard something playing from his phone one evening, met us. Me dindu, and turned to find him slightly embarrassed in a way that she found, against all reasonable expectations, enormously endearing. "Don't laugh," he'd said. She laughed completely, the real kind. He had looked at her laughing and said nothing, and had the expression of a man who had just received something he didn't fully know how to hold yet, but was absolutely certain he wanted to keep. On a Sunday evening in October, they were walking along the Han River. The light was that particular autumn gold, low and warm and making everything it touched look slightly more significant than usual. Other people moved around them, joggers, families, a child chasing a dog in enormous, delighted circles. He stopped walking. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had come to recognize as him about to say something real, something he hadn't rehearsed, hadn't controlled, hadn't run through the filter of who he was supposed to be. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Not a grand gesture," he said quickly. "I know you said no grand gestures." "I did say that." "This is small," he said, "relatively." She waited. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, produced a small box, not a ring box, not yet, she noted, something flatter, rectangular. She took it. I opened it. Inside, nestled in plain paper, was a brass key. She looked at it, then at him. "The apartment on the 3rd floor of my building," he said. "I had it renovated. It has a window that faces east. You mentioned once that you work better with morning light. It has a room that could be an office or a study or both." He paused. "It's yours, whether or not anything else follows. You don't owe me anything for it. I'm not trading it for anything. I just..." He stopped, steadied himself. "I want you to have a place in Seoul that is yours, that no one can manage you out of. That is just yours." She looked at the key. A brass key, small, ordinary, the least romantic object imaginable. She had to press her lips together for a moment. "You're terrible at no grand gestures," she said. "I'm aware," he said. She closed her fingers around the key. I looked up at him. "I'm going to need you to understand something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I am not a woman who forgets," she said. "I don't mean that as a threat. I just mean I carry things. I always will. The good and the hard both. If you're in my life, you're in all of it. The mornings when I am fine and the days when I am not. The work that matters to me. The gray tant I visit every year. The book I've been trying to finish for 6 months. All of it." She held his gaze. "I am not a detail. I don't know the details." "I know," he said, without hesitation. "And if you ever..." "Kalani," his voice was quiet, certain. "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. The river moved beside them. The light was going golden dark. The child with the dog shrieked with laughter somewhere behind them. "Okay," she said. The same word as before, in the apartment with the cold tea. But it's different now, fuller, like a door opening instead of just unlocking. She took his hand. They walked. No announcement, no performance, just two people on a river path in autumn, choosing consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost and the history and the long, difficult road it had taken to get here, choosing each other. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in a small bookshop in Seoul, he asked her to marry him. He did not get down on one knee dramatically. He did not arrange for strangers to film it. He simply picked up the same book, that book, the one from Mensa and Sons, the one they still kept on the shelf in what was now, quietly and officially, their shared home, and opened it to the first page, where he had written, in careful handwriting, "For the person I should have stayed for, I'm staying now. Will you let me?" She read it standing in the bookshop aisle with her coat still on, and her scarf slightly crooked. She looked at him. He looked back. "Yes," she said. Simple, sure. Like she'd known the answer for a long time, and had just been waiting for the question to finally be asked properly. "Before we go, stay with me for just one more moment." This story was never really about a mafia boss and a DNA result. Those were just the doors we walked through to get somewhere more important. This story was about what happens when we allow other people, their fears, their biases, their ideas about who belongs with whom and why, to make our most intimate decisions for us. Han Dojin didn't choose to walk away from Kalani. Someone chose him, and because he never questioned it, he lived inside that choice for 5 years as though it were his own. How many of us have done that? Not with a manipulative advisor, but with a voice in our own heads, inherited from a parent, a culture, a system, a world that told us certain connections were inconvenient, certain people didn't fit the picture, certain love stories weren't worth the complication. Kalani didn't come back to be saved or rescued or proven worthy. She came back because she believed in the right of truth to exist on the record. She carried that folder for 3 years not out of bitterness, out of faith. Faith that reality, given enough time and enough courage, surfaces. It always does. And Dojin's real journey wasn't falling in love again. It was learning to think for himself, to question the architecture of who he'd been told to be, to choose slowly, imperfectly, consistently, something real over something convenient. The lesson, if there is one, is this. Examine your choices, really examine them. Ask yourself which ones you made, and which ones were made for you. Because the life that was built on someone else's fear of your love story, that is not your life. That is a story someone told you to keep you in a shape that suited them. You are allowed to put down their version and write your own. If this story moved something in you, if you heard yourself in Kalani's patience or Dojin's awakening, or even in Abina's diary entries about a love that refused to be silent, then share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment telling me which moment hit you the hardest, and if you believe that truth always finds its way back. Let me know below, because the next story is already waiting, and it is going to find you right where you are.